but then you have to let go. And if you don't let go, it's like it becomes suffocating, and I can't live with you anymore. You know, but there are times for holding on, times for letting go, times for holding on, times for letting go. And a spiritual path needs to do that too. Spiritual teaching needs to hold us and contain us, but also needs to set us free. And that's the interesting challenge I think we are at today in terms of the sort of spiritual development of humanity, if one can use such a big term, is that as the containers break down, as so many people find that conventional religions don't hold them anymore, or they don't want to be held like that anymore, we're free, but then when we also need to be held. We need to be held when we're going through grief, when we lose somebody, when we need some sense of direction, and when we need a sense of community. All these things require a certain sort of holding. And that's the challenge for us, I think, in these days, is how do we find spiritual directions that give us freedom, but also hold us in a way. So then you had, at some point in this process, these islands have split away. The Ice Age has happened, the ice sheets have started to melt back, the North Sea has filled up, tribes have moved across, with undoubtedly a kind of basic spirituality of working with fire, working with the power of the stars, sensing the energy of the land, sensing the old tracks, which were originally forged by animals across the land, but then humans started to follow them as well. And you start to, if you can imagine, that's when you start to develop spiritual ways that are related to the local landscape, if you like. And then towards, there was a big change in temperature, and people stopped building stone circles. There were times of war and so on that can be traced archaeologically. But at a certain time, from around 2000 BC, something like that, onwards, you start to get the emergence of a distinct group of people who were called the Druids. And we know about this from the classical writers, Julius Caesar and Diodorus Siculus and so on, started to write about these people in these islands who were divided into three classes of bards, ovates and druids, who held ceremonies, and this carried on, this period of Druidry that we know about, carried on until the coming of Christianity. The Romans came, and on the whole, the Romans had a policy of incorporating and tolerating local cults, because it was politically the wisest thing to do. Why make a problem? And they only actually persecuted the Druids because of Boudicca, at a time when Boudicca rebelled and she attacked London and Colchester. And there's a wonderful story of the Druid using the animal as an oracle, which we'll use in a bit ourselves, to predict the outcome of the battle. And he released a hare from his cloak, and if it went to the left, they would be triumphant. It went to the right, they would lose. It went to the left, and so they attacked Colchester and killed a lot of people. And the Romans retaliated, and they retaliated at the sort of financial centre. It's a bit like we go for the Al-Qaeda bank accounts. The Romans went for the Druids' source of gold, which was coming across from Ireland to Mona, which is present-day Anglesey. And there's a big slaughtering of the Druids. And there's this extraordinary account. When you say, were there any female Druids? Yes, there were. There's this extraordinary account of how the Romans were massed on the shores of Wales and about to go off across to attack the Druids. And there were Druid priestesses who had their clothes ripped. They were wearing black, and they were shouting curses at the Roman soldiers. And the Roman generals had to walk amongst the ranks, saying, "These women have no power, you can attack." And so they went across on the boats and massacred everyone on the island. Apart from that incident, the Romans tolerated Druidry. With the coming of Christianity, something changed. We had there was a monopolist agenda with Christianity, and by around 600 AD, all of Britain was Christian, at least nominally so. But even then, Christianity integrated much of the pre-Christian pagan practices, such as Druidry. You can see this very clearly in, it's written down. There's one wording that I remember about the festival of Imbolc. In Druidry we have 8 festivals around the year: the solstices, the equinoxes, and the cross-quarter days. And February the 1st is called Imbolc. In Christianity it's called Candlemas. And Pope, somebody in the 4th century I think it is, said, since the people cannot be dissuaded from parading in the streets with candles, tell them that they can come into our churches and our priests will bless the candles. It's a very clever piece of engineering, social engineering really, to say it's okay, you can keep doing it, and our priests will bless the candles, so this is an added bonus. And so you can deconstruct Christianity and look at all the elements of it and find many pagan influences, from the vestments of the priests that are drawn from the classical Greek mystery schools, from the outline of the churches. Even the concept of the sacrificed Saviour is found all over the Mediterranean basin. So the difference being that in the stories all around the Mediterranean basin, the sacrificed god had a consort, a female consort, so there was balance, and somehow the story was changed with Christianity. So for 1,000 years in history, Druidry went underground. But the story is more complex than that. And the reason I'm mentioning all this to you is because we have to, our story, if you like, or the story of these lands, is very particular and different. We don't have an indigenous tradition that some other cultures might have that stretch back for thousands of years. You know, when you go to India, for instance, you know, there's this extraordinary fact that you will see people chanting mantras that have been there for thousands of years. You know, so there's this complete sense of continuity. The sort of a kind of collective wound, if you like, in the psyche here is around the fact that there was this repression around, you know, between say the 6th and the 7th century, which shut down a lot of the spiritual practice. In places like Latvia, this happened in the 11th century. Christianity came, I'm not sure about Sweden, I don't know when it happened, but it came to different countries at different times. There was a kind of co-opting of things, but there was also repression too. But for instance, if you take the bardic schools, the tradition of the bards continued on into the 17th century in Ireland and in Scotland. St. Martin went out to the Outer Hebrides in the 17th century, and he said the bards there were still, in order to incubate a poem, they were still going into a bothy, which is like an old little cottage, shutting all the doors and the windows, wrapping a scarf around their eyes, and then laying a stone on their chest and lying in the darkness. The stone on the chest is an interesting one. You can do this with a telephone directory or a large stone if you have one, and you lie there in a dark room and put a scarf around and see. It's a very weird thing. What's happening from a kind of neurological point of view is you're getting this one, it's like playing white noise through headphones. You're getting one monotonous sensory input that is terribly annoying, and in the end the brain says, and shuts down that part of the brain and opens you up in a different way. But what they were doing is, you can see that from the 17th century, you can trace this idea of going into the darkness and waiting to receive this one drop of illumination, right the way back to the activity in the caves. Fast forward 1,000 years and you get to the 17th century, the Enlightenment. The grip of Christianity is starting to loosen with the Enlightenment, and people start to look at their heritage. Texts are translated out of Latin and Greek. Printing presses start printing these accounts of the Druids in English, and America is discovered. So people discover that there are initially this idea of the noble savage. They discover people who haven't heard the good news of the Bible, who are actually rather nice. And the first reports coming back from America were, hey, these people are living in a kind of paradise. They're really friendly. They're giving us gifts and all the rest of it. It all went sort of sour a bit later. But to begin with, that was happening. And this, together with reading the texts about the Druids in Germany, France, and England, was this extraordinary kind of wake-up call, if you like, or discovery of the ancestors. It's like, oh, I thought they were grunting savages, but Caesar and Siculus and so on say that our ancestors were philosophers and bards and poets, and this was extraordinary. I think the equivalent, the way to understand it, imagine you were adopted and your adoptive parents told you that your biological parents were good for nothings. They were just hopeless, whatever. And then one day, you're about 16, they go out of the house, there's an old chest in the attic. You open the chest and you find a book written by your mother, and you discover she was a philosopher. You find a photo album of your parents, and you discover that they were actually great, wonderful, wise people. So it was the same thing with people in Europe. They'd been suffering from what's called the Dummheit theory, and the Dummheit theory is the theory of original stupidity, that we were grunting in caves until the good news of the Bible, and then we went, we progressed, and of course, then progressed up in an upward arc. But suddenly that was overturned, and people started to form little societies, and that was called, that was the time of the rebirth of Druidry in the modern era, 17th century. So we have 300 years of recorded history of modern Druidry that has drawn on the inspiration of the past, the classical writers, the information we have from archaeology, from folklore, which we'll be working with a little bit later, from the old stories, because the Christian writers had a kind of love affair with paganism, and even though they tried to repress it in some ways, they also wrote down the old stories. So we have the old stories. So in the 6th century, as the door closed on Druidry and pre-Christian religions, somehow the information got through as the door closed. It snuck through as the Christian scribes wrote down the old myths and the tales. 300 years of this, fast forward to the 1960s, you have the whole kind of revolution of flower power. Over those 300 years, you've had Druidry becoming kind of informed also by the whole Western esoteric tradition of magic and of the Golden Dawn and of Freemasonry and of influences coming from the East, of Wicca, of all sorts of things happening. And then you get the 1960s and flower power, and that's kind of when I came across my old Druid teacher. So it was in kind of 69, that sort of time. And from that period onwards, Druidry started another kind of renaissance, accelerating in the 1980s and 90s as people started to realize what was happening to the planet, and yearning for a kind of green religion or green spiritual way, if you like, that connected us to the earth. John Michel wrote a book called A View Over Atlantis in the 1960s, where he took the idea of ley lines and ideas from the Far East and put them together with the ideas of Feng Shui and Chinese ideas, to put them together. And suddenly there was this idea of this network of magical lines across the land. You started having festivals at Stonehenge, the whole festival culture coming in, and Druids became part of the kind of alternative scene, I suppose. So now, today, Druidry is this kind of vibrant nature spirituality. The order that I lead has 25,000 members. We do a training that's published in 7 different languages. We have 200 groups around the world. When I was being initiated at the age of 18 on Glastonbury tour to the sounds of the Third Ear Band, which are a wonderful, really esoteric band. Little did I know that standing amongst these mainly elderly people, this small group of elderly people, that when I was 18, so that almost like, yeah, almost 50 years later, I would be in Glastonbury, I was there just a couple of weeks ago, where hundreds of people are standing there, like kids and dogs and animals, and just festivity and this wonderful kind of vibrant sense of aliveness. And I think the reason is because it speaks to these three parts of ourselves, the bard inside us. All of us want to sing our song, to be creative, all of us want to kind of journey in the other world and to explore the depths. And all of us, I guess, would like to have some kind of wisdom. And so let's have, if you're up for it, are you okay for a little journey? Yeah, okay. Just a short one, just 10 minutes or so. And